Welcome back, everyone, to another news episode of the College Sports Hive. That is Leif Tulane, and I am Scott Stevens, coming back live for you with some news this week and entering another weekend chock full of college football for you. This is our fifth week of production, so thanks everyone for following along and keeping up with us. We really appreciate the support and everything that you all have done. We have some updates for you in terms of news. First off, we're going to touch on the Miami Hurricanes. They had a couple issues with COVID last week that weren't really announced very well, and so that affected their game, as well as what's going to happen with them moving forward in their season. South Carolina has a coaching change to address, which is prevalent for people in the SEC. And then another game cancellation already that we have to bring you this weekend, as well as we touched on. I would do some research, some background information for all of you about the COVID-19 protocol breakdowns between the conferences. We've touched on how this is such a touch and go subject. We've talked about how each conference is kind of doing their own thing, and we have that information for you to bring you up to speed there. It's a little late in the game. We understand things are happening, but it's I guess better late than never. So, and then as always, we'll touch on the changes of the rankings this week. Not a whole lot fluctuated, but there is some interesting topics to get to. So that'll be the last thing we talk about. The Miami Hurricanes were missing 13 players in their game against Virginia Tech, and were still able to pull out that win. So that kind of leads to some understanding as to how close that game actually was. I'm not sure if the people at ESPN, the FPI, knew that they were going to miss so many players, and they had that factored into the FPI giving Virginia Tech the edge in that game. So this is a very intriguing situation moving forward, Leaf. What do we know about what's happening with Miami in these next few weeks?
Yeah, so Miami was interesting because I read an interview that said Miami was very close to not playing that game at all against Virginia Tech. And I wonder, had they lost, they ended up winning 25-24. If they'd lost, they could have compromised some of their season because they still have a very outside chance to win the ACC. But anyway, they're not going to play their next 2 weeks, and the ACC will reshuffle the schedule to make sure they're able to play. And they still have opponents that were supposed to play Miami, and that would be Wake Forest and North Carolina. So a very interesting situation, and I think, like the SEC with a lot of their COVID cancellations, the ACC has the luxury of starting earlier so they have more time to make it up, whereas the Big Ten and Pac-12, it's kind of a done deal at this point. When they have those games, they turn into cancellations, not postponements.
Yeah, Miami will now play Wake Forest on December 5th and North Carolina on December 12th. They already had that North Carolina game scheduled for the 5th, so they bumped that back a week and Wake Forest into that 5th slot. It's going to be intriguing because Miami still has an outside shot of playing for an ACC championship game if something were to happen to either Clemson or Notre Dame in the rest of their games this season and Miami were to win out. December 5th is that date slotted for that ACC championship game. So that is marked in there with an asterisk saying if they play for the ACC championship game, they will play the ACC championship game and not that one game against Wake Forest. So this is an effort to make sure that Miami still plays as many games as the rest of the teams in the ACC, and that is pending on how their performance and what happens with other teams in the ACC left so far in the season. So it was really intriguing to hear that they were missing 13 players. How do you so 2 weeks removed now, they won't play for another 2 weeks. What do you think this Miami team will look like once they're back in action?
Well, you hope that everyone's able to come back and play, and obviously there's some complications that come from it. But assuming that everyone is able to come back and play in those 2 weeks, I think they'll be well rested and well studied, but they may not be able to practice as much because of restrictions. So it'll be interesting to see, can they execute at the same level, and will the rest outweigh the lack of practice, or will rust outweigh rest? And I thought Derek King's starting to play really, really good football. Quarterback for transferred from Houston. He's at the Miami now, and he's a sneaky fringe Heisman contender. As you mentioned last week, him and Trask went to the same high school, and they're both Heisman contenders. So, I mean, their offense was clicking. Their defense had a lot of penalties, and we don't know which players have it. So I wonder how they come back and what side of the ball fares better from this time off.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what kind of Miami team comes back after this break. We saw Wisconsin not really lose a beat after their issues there with COVID-19, and they were able to come back and look strong and dominate a Michigan team there last weekend. So it'll be very intriguing to see where Miami's at after these next 2 weeks, and we'll keep it down in the South now. South Carolina has fired their head coach Will Muschamp. The Gamecocks fell to 2-5 so far on their year, and they allowed 759 yards of total offense to Ole Miss last week. We touched on there was a lot of offense in a few of the games that we recapped on Sunday, but 759 kind of puts that all those numbers that we touched on to shame.
Yeah, I mean, Ole Miss puts up points, but anytime you get Lane Kiffin, like knowing there's a highlight of him already seeing a touchdown and it's like an 80-yard bomb, like, and it's 40 yards open and Lane Kiffin's the closest guy to catching his own player. Doesn't bode well. And the interesting thing is South Carolina started off the year fairly well. They played some good teams close. They upset Auburn, and they've fallen apart recently. And I wonder how much of that is Will Muschamp and how much is just superior talent from other teams in the SEC. But I think they needed to make a change. And South Carolina hasn't been a very good football program since Steve Spurrier numerous years ago.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think this is going to affect some of the other coaches in the college football realm of aspects, like Jim Harbaugh and other places around the country that are kind of having grumblings about head coaching issues and the way their program is performing?
I hadn't thought about it, but it very well could be the first domino or the first guy to fall. And then, Michigan loses another game and Harbaugh's gone. I personally prefer to see coaches finish out a season and then you fire them the day after or whatever. But sometimes there's something to be said for an interim coach. That's how Clay Helton won his job. He took over for Steve Sarkisian at USC, and they finished off the year nicely. And now Clay Helton's the head coach. It's not always the best answer, but at least it gives someone internal rather than external a chance to win over a locker room, and there's some experience there.
Yeah, for sure. And Will Muschamp was a guy that coached at Florida, coached at a couple other different places. So he's a well-distinguished name in the realm of college football. So this not really surprised with how South Carolina was performing, but it's one of those things that they were very happy to bring in Will Muschamp. They thought he was going to be the answer to that program after Steve Spurrier, like you touched on, but it just didn't end up panning out. And after a few bad performances, he is out for South Carolina. I do not have the name of who is going to replace him this week and the weeks moving forward as the interim head coach, so I'm very sorry about that. But Will Muschamp is no longer going to be the head coach of South Carolina. Keeping in the SEC, the game cancellation that we have for you as of this moment, the only one that we've heard announced is Ole Miss at Texas A&M. We've touched on Texas A&M's COVID issues. They shut down practices early in the week last week due to some positive cases, and it seems like it's a scenario that isn't necessarily completely under control because this is already canceled this was announced on Monday, yesterday. So what do we think about this move by Texas A&M and what's the situation looking like down there?
I mean, it's unfortunate, and it's interesting because of the way they initially communicated. Oh, there's only a few cases. We're probably going to play last week, and they ended up postponing that game, and now it's getting worse clearly. And it reminds me a little bit of the Utah situation. They cancel one game at the last second, and there's no rumor, and then it gets worse. And I'm hoping that they don't get to the point where there's 28 positives or anything that would really hinder them from playing games other than for safety's sake. But also they're the fifth ranked team last week, at least, in the country. And so anytime you have a team one spot removed from a college football playoff, missing 2 games, that's going to greatly impact the ranking system, both in entering and the final ranking. If they can't play and then they end up playing shorthanded, or they win barely because they're shorthanded, then that's going to impact their season greatly, and the seasons of Florida, BYU, Cincinnati. And so this is a really big thing to monitor for college football as a whole.
Yeah, I just think it's really intriguing that they waited so long last week to cancel their game, and now this week it's already canceled pretty much the Monday after the weekend. So I think it's a situation that probably isn't necessarily under control. We don't have numbers for you. They haven't announced how many players, how many coaches, anything like that have tested positive for COVID. So we know that it's a situation that's going to be ongoing and developing over the next few weeks, as all of these have been. So with that being said, it's transitioned beautifully. We've been talking about COVID pretty much every single news episode that we've put out. We've talked on a couple different programs having issues with outbreaks and how they've handled them. We touched on how Trevor Lawrence missed 10 days due to his COVID positive tests, and then Graham Mertz missed 21 due to his COVID positive tests, and the difference in the protocols there between Big Ten and ACC conferences. So we've done a little bit of research here and have some information based upon the differences that the conferences are taking to try and combat these COVID positive issues. Leif, do you want to kind of touch on what the Big Ten's doing in a nutshell?
Yeah, for sure. So the Big Ten's requiring student athletes, coaches, trainers, anyone who's affiliated with the program that will be on the field for practices and games to undergo daily antigen testings. The test results must be completed and recorded prior to each game or practice. And the student athletes who test positive for the coronavirus through the point of contact daily testing would require a polymerase chain reaction, a PCR test, to confirm the results of the point of contact test. So that's, essentially that everyone's getting tested every day, and they have two tests that clarify and then test if it's a false positive if someone were to test positive.
Yeah, for sure. And it's very intriguing here because the Big Ten has announced that the earliest a student athlete can return to game competition is 21 days following a COVID positive diagnosis. And that's different than anywhere else in the country. The ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12 all have announced that is a 10-day threshold for them in their conference. So that's why you see some of these players coming back quicker than you do in the Big 10. The NCAA kind of just gave the conferences general guidelines that they would like them to follow, and then gave them the power to do it pretty much however they wanted, which could be potentially good or bad. But this is what has led us to these differences in scenarios, these differences in protocols, and it's affecting teams differently, because you look at the Big Ten and you look at Wisconsin, and you see players out for a very significant amount of time. They missed 3 games. It's been very intriguing to see what's happening there. And then you look at Trevor Lawrence, who missed 2, but 1 was due to just another positive COVID test a few days after. So it's very intriguing. And you look at what's happening in the Pac-12, and it's very similar to what the Big Ten is doing. They have daily testing with the point of contact daily testing, and then they also require those athletes to take once a week that PCR test, which is just to ensure that it's a little bit deeper and a little bit more accurate of a test to make sure that none of them were false positives, and make sure they have a baseline for everything moving forward. And then we've touched on the 53 scholarship minimum that the teams need to have for their games to be able to happen. What do we know about that moving forward, Leif?
Yeah, so for instance, in the Big 12, teams need to have at least 53 players available for each game, including walk-on or scholarship players. So we had been saying scholarship players, but a lot of players that qualify for this are walk-ons who later get scholarships, or just current walk-ons, so we apologize to the walk-ons who are playing, and very important for these teams, especially in a time like COVID-19 era. Teams in the SEC have the same player minimum. All 53 athletes need to be on scholarship, though. Both conferences have player minimums for certain position groups, requiring 4 available interior defensive linemen, 7 available offensive linemen, and 1 quarterback. So, for instance, Utah was going to play a wide receiver at quarterback, and so that wouldn't have met the requirements in the SEC and the Big 12. The biggest difference between those two conferences, the Big 12 and the SEC, though, the biggest difference is that the SEC gives schools the option to continue playing even if they do not meet these parameters, which is frankly astounding to me. And the conference is not planning on canceling games unless the team feels it is too heavily impacted.
Yeah, and this is where the issues come in for me in in my understanding of what's happening here. It's just, you look at these demographics of it turns out to look like from the outside that these schools are just trying to get the games in any way that they possibly can. This, from the reading of and the letter of the law of what the SEC put out, this does not seem to be the best and most safe way to handle all of this for player safety, for fan safety, for anything going like that. We'll touch on fans here in a little bit because that's a big part of this as well. But then you look at this and it's also the same conferences that have two open dates to make up games in. So that's why you're seeing these games be postponed instead of canceled like they are in the Big Ten and the Pac-12. The Pac-12 started 2 weeks ago, and the Big Ten started a few weeks before that. So they were already behind the eight ball. They didn't have enough time to add in these open weeks to say, oh, you couldn't play this week, you can make it up later. No, it's December 5th is conference championship week. Like you're dealing with a slim margin of time to deal with what's happening here. So we're getting down to the wire and where people are at, but the SEC and the ACC and all these teams are allowing people to make up games later on in their season. So that's why you see some fluctuation there as well. Okay, so with all of that being said, we've touched on the Big Ten's daily testing. We've touched on the Pac-12's daily testing. The Big 12 and the SEC and the ACC are all mandating 3 tests a week for their players. So that's a very big difference in the scheme of things there as well. One of those tests is the rapid antigen test, which is the point of contact test that the Pac-12 and Big Ten are doing daily. And that's basically to just give them a baseline of where they're at, and then the 2 weekly PCR tests, which are a little bit more accurate ones to make sure that they're all good to go for the week. But you see, the daily testing is supposed to basically contain outbreaks, right? And to make sure that these players are not necessarily, and to ensure that there's not a few days of buildup of people that have positive tests before you get 10 or 15 all at once. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the reason the Pac-12. So, for instance, Utah had bad cases, and that may not be preventable. But you've been seeing teams all over the country been able to diagnose that they get them in successive days, which allows the games to be postponed, rather than say, well, we tested negative on Wednesday, and now we're heading into Saturday, and we're traveling over to wherever they're playing the game, and which should cause really, really unfortunate results. So I think there's something to be said for the conferences doing the daily testing. It's just safer that way, but obviously there's some financial and resources that need to be there. But you've been seeing the SEC had 4 of their 6 conference games this past week be canceled, and I know they have time, but I wonder if that some of that time and money that they'd make from football, especially in football-rich environment in the South, could be spent on protecting some of these players, which would allow the games to happen on schedule.
Absolutely, and I've heard things from the Alabama camp and things like that of Nick Saban saying we do daily testing because we have that the resources and the know-how to make that happen. So I've seen things like that, but that's a very individual one-time like scenario in the SEC. That's not conference mandated. That's not necessarily what every team is doing. So just want to give that caveat there to Alabama people out there. They seem to be doing very well themselves. But with that being said, you look at kind of the disparity almost between the way games seem to be postponed and canceled. When you look at things like what happened this weekend in the Pac-12, is there's already talk of canceling the football season after 2 teams were not able to compete due to COVID issues. That's Arizona State and Utah. And they've already been talking about shutting the whole thing down. And so, but then you look at this, have 4 games and 4 of the best teams in the SEC not play, and this past weekend due to COVID issues, and it just seems like they're postponing things and pushing them back and trying to deal with it as it comes, rather than getting ahead of any of the situations. Would you kind of agree with all that or no?
Yeah, and it's consistent with how quickly they wanted to get back too. Like the Pac-12 was willing not to play football, as well as the Big Ten. They both voted that it's not prudent to play football during the off season. And obviously the schools want to play football. I mean, that it's a huge revenue maker, and the students want to play and everything. But there's something to be said for a pandemic happening. And these two conferences seemed more astute and aware of those legitimate issues than the other conferences. And so I think they're more willing to give up on it for the safety of the students rather than prioritizing money, which seems to be a big emphasis for the SEC, Big 12, and ACC, who are postponing games every weekend in order to play. And obviously everyone wants their kids to be safe and the programs to play, but it's a changing environment, and it's interesting to see how the different conferences have different guidelines and different ethical priorities.
Yeah, and it's like, speaking of ethical priorities, let's move into fans. Let's move into how the different conferences are kind of handling their fan bases. The ACC is determining whether each university, in the ACC determines whether or not they're going to have fans. So the conference pretty much left it up to the school to determine what's best for them. That's why you see a lot of fans at Clemson games, and then you see no fans at a Boston College game last weekend against Notre Dame. So that's up to the school and to the university to decide what to do there. What do we know about the ACC and the SEC?
Yeah, so the ACC, like you said, determines whether it'll be fans or not. Vanderbilt and the SEC is the only school that is not allowing fans. Everyone else is allowing at least 25% capacity. But as we've both hinted at, it seems as if there's more than 25% capacity being let in at some of these games. I mean, Dan Mullen, Florida's head coach, as we've drawn back to a few times, said he wants to fill up the swamp with 90,000 fans. It was a poorly timed quote because obviously they got hit by a bout of COVID, but they played at College Station, and there were at least, I'd say, around 50,000 fans there in a big stadium, so that was not 25%. As for the Big 12, every single school is allowing fans, but they've been pretty quiet on the COVID front, to be honest. And the Pac-12 and Big 10, the Pac-12 has mandated 0 fans for any school. Big 10 is allowing only friends and family numbers less than 1,000. So we can kind of see consistency there as well with keeping the numbers slim for the schools who had more hesitancy to return to football.
Yeah, other than Baylor, basically in the beginning of the Big 12 season, that was probably the biggest blow to the Big 12 so far in terms of COVID issues. Yeah, so this is a lot to unpack. There's a lot of information here that we just divulged and talked about to all of you out there. Please let us know if there's any questions on any of this. This is still ongoing, and it changes very, very frequently for not the protocols necessarily, but how teams are adapting and changing to these protocols, and what's happening in the grand scheme of things in terms of college football is changing, and it changes every day. So please make sure, if you have any questions, to reach out to us. We'll do our best to help you to help divulge some more for you and hash out any problems that you're having understanding all of this. It's so tough to kind of keep up with what each Power 5 conference is doing, and this is just the Power 5. This isn't necessarily the group of 5 conferences that all have different protocols as well. So if you have any questions about those, we'll be happy to talk about that as well in another episode moving forward. Do you have anything else to add about that?
Yeah, and I just wanted to, I think you might know it better than I do. What are some schools doing when reincorporating players? Because I know they have to test their heart and everything. So you want to take some people through the protocols to get people back on the field. For instance, Wisconsin had so many, and then now they're back on the field.
So yeah, I think the best case scenario to investigate that into is what the Big Ten's doing. All COVID positive student athletes have to undergo comprehensive cardiac testing, include labs and biomarkers, ECG, echocardiogram, and cardiac MRIs. That's a whole lot of testing on an individual person to make sure that their body is handling the virus well enough to make sure that they don't develop pre-existing conditions that put them at risk to injure them further throughout the rest of the season. Following this cardiac evaluation, student athletes must receive clearance from a cardiologist designated by the university. So that's a whole lot of things to happen. So I think that's kind of why you see the 21-day like furlough, I guess you could, I guess is a word you could use for it, to have them not play for 21 days after a positive diagnosis, because all of that stuff needs to happen for them to get cleared in the Big Ten. But then you look at that, there's no sort of information available to find about any sort of tests or anything like that in the ACC, SEC, or Big 12 to kind of see what they're doing to combat these people that have tested positive, other than whenever they do test negative, they have that 10-day period where they can't play, and then they're back to the field. So maybe if anyone has any further information that could help us out here, that would be lovely. But as of right now, as of what we're seeing, that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you put it well that is the reason for 21 days. I mean, you need 3 weeks and you need some time to get all these tests. And obviously they're prioritized as athletes that for marquee programs such as Wisconsin, but these things take time. It's not, science can't be rushed, and the health of the players is paramount. So I think it's honorable what the Big Ten's doing, at least taking the time to say, hey, I know we care about our football, but we care about our players more, and this is like the time we need to put you back into the game.
Absolutely. It's never changing time for everyone involved, players, coaches, fans, everything like that. With that being said, there is still a top 25 to divulge into this week. There's teams that are playing very good football. There's teams that are on the downslide. So let's dive into that a little bit. We have the exact same top 8 that we did the week before. Alabama stays at number 1. Notre Dame is at number 2. Ohio State slots in there at number 3. Clemson 4. Texas A&M 5. Florida 6. Cincinnati 7. And BYU is at 8. You look at this and you say Texas A&M didn't play, Clemson didn't play, Ohio State didn't play, and Alabama didn't play. So that's 4 of your top 5 that didn't play. So we're not necessarily very surprised to see not a lot of fluctuation there. Notre Dame did play, and they did beat Boston College, but it wasn't a performance worthy enough to jump Alabama to be the number 1 team in the country, in my personal opinion. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think Alabama's proven more so far, but Notre Dame did move up in terms of number 1 votes. They didn't get the number 1 spot, but it was kind of a landslide once Notre Dame beat Clemson. That Alabama was almost unanimous as the number 1 team in the country. And this week there was a little more discrepancy of votes. There were some people on the voting committee that said, oh, look, Notre Dame played and won while the other teams didn't do anything. The one that surprised me a little bit, honestly, was Texas A&M. I know they beat Florida, which stands for something, but Florida looked dominant. They put up 63 points and could have put up more. And Texas A&M hasn't really done anything since playing Florida, in my opinion. And obviously they were off last week and will be off again this week. So that one surprised me a little bit, and will be something to monitor going forward as their season is postponed as we speak.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays into what's happening there in Texas A&M, right? Like you don't know how a committee or the AP is going to view that, of them not playing games and Florida continuing to look dominant. I agree with you that I was a little bit surprised that Florida didn't jump Texas A&M this week. I think if there's another very dominant performance from that Florida team this weekend, they will end up taking over that number 5 slot over Texas A&M. And yeah, you just also look at these Cincinnati and BYU teams who are sitting there at 7-8 undefeated, and they're still saying, how are Texas A&M or Florida ranked above us? We haven't lost yet. So there's a lot of intriguing things in this top 8. Like, you're never going to necessarily view a team that's been dominant like Florida less than a team who has played the competition that BYU or Cincinnati has. So I get that for sure, but also there's that Texas A&M kind of wild card sitting in there, how that's going to affect their season moving forward. A couple different changes was the number 9 and the number 10 slot. Indiana bumped up from number 10 to number 9 after another win over Michigan State last weekend. Wisconsin also jumped up from number 13 to number 10 after their dominating performance against Michigan. Do we agree with how they're slotted in there at number 9 and number 10?
Yeah, we talked about this last week, and we were a little surprised that Miami previously was ahead of Indiana. And I think the team, they got it right this week. And Miami eked out a win over Virginia Tech, and Indiana dominated Michigan State. And so I think that was a pretty – they told the committee, hey, we're here for real. And the committee was like, well, we got to value that they're undefeated. And I think they did that. I personally think Wisconsin's a better team than Indiana, but because they've only played 2 games, I think it's fair that Indiana is ranked ahead of them, as well as BYU, as well as Cincinnati, just because they've got a larger body of work. But you can only judge so much off of 2 performances, and so I think it's fair that they move up because there's a dominant performance, and some other teams eked out wins, as I mentioned. So I think it's fair they jumped up to 10 spot, and it'll be interesting to see how much they can make up in terms of ground because they've only played those 2 games.
Absolutely. You see Indiana there at number 9. That sets up a top 10 matchup between Ohio State and Indiana this weekend, number 3 versus number 9. So that'll be a fun one to watch there in the horseshoe. Wisconsin will have to play Northwestern later in the season. Moving right along to them, they were the biggest mover this week, was Northwestern. They moved up 4 slots to number 19 from number 23. So let's talk about that, because they're 4-0, looking very dominant, and they're gonna have this chance to challenge Wisconsin and have a crack at having a pretty historic season.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest game, the Big Ten West. They're both undefeated teams, and we briefly spoke about this last time, but I mean, Wisconsin's probably a better team, but if they can get a win and become and they go through undefeated and beat Wisconsin, or even if they lose but they beat Wisconsin in the head-to-head, they're the team that likely plays Ohio State or Indiana, and there's really, in this year especially of all years, there's really some room to make some noise, and it's an impressive performance from Pat Fitzgerald's group.
Yeah, for sure. Let's keep going a little bit here. Oregon slotted in there at number 11 to kind of round out those teams that I personally view have a chance to make the college football playoff. I would say the top 11, it's already narrowed down to those few teams, because you look at number 12, and that's Miami, and number 13 is Georgia, and number 14 is Oklahoma State. And you look at those teams all that have lost, Georgia twice already, and you just think you don't necessarily see a very clear path for them in the college football playoff. There's a few different things that could happen to Miami if Notre Dame or Clemson were to lose again, and then they make the ACC championship game and then they win that. That's a scenario that could potentially play out, but that's a little bit of a long shot, especially with their COVID issues as of right now. Oklahoma State has a massive game this weekend against Oklahoma, who's resurged in a big way, is up to number 18 again in the country. And then you look at Georgia, and they're on the outside looking in the SEC East behind Florida. And so you think there's a lot that has to happen for those teams to even have a chance to make the college football playoffs. So it seems like the top 11 is where you can draw the line as of right now that have a legitimate claim to say we could potentially have a spot in that top 4.
Yeah, for sure. I think you nailed it, that there are only 11 teams in the country that have any shot, and some of these are slim chances at best. I mean, Oregon will only play 6 games. And so far through 2 games, they haven't looked perfect. And through 6 games, and Wisconsin too, you're going to have to look really, really good to get into that top 4 based off resume alone, because it's just not as much of a body of work. And those are the only 11. I think Georgia's out because they lost their big test against Alabama at the start of the year, and then they still had the slight chance that they could get a rematch, and Florida beat them, like you said. I think Miami's out. And it's because that they lost to Clemson, and now they have to hope for Clemson and Notre Dame to mess up. And their COVID test makes it so they'll be 2 weeks out. And even if they do lose there, they don't have enough time to make up the ground. So there's an interesting factor of this year having rescheduled games that you don't typically see. So it's wider in some sense of who can make it, but it's also it puts an eliminator on, and I think you nailed it. I think it's 11 teams, and those 11 are the ones for the rest of the season. And any team that loses here could be out, and it's kind of a weird eliminating process this year.
Absolutely. I think if Oregon loses, I think if Wisconsin loses, I think if Indiana, BYU, Cincinnati, any of those teams lose, they're done. And it's unfortunate to say that way, but it's just the terms that you signed up for as an Oregon team coming in that late into the game. And it's an interesting point to bring up Oregon, is because they have not necessarily made an impressive case to say that they're a top 10 team in the country. They looked okay against Stanford. They dominated the second half of the game, but that was with Stanford very shorthanded. And then they almost they were in a very bad spot against Washington State, and a quick momentum play before halftime, really turned that game around for them, and they pulled out a Pullman with a W. But I think Oregon needs to start making some more impressive strides and some bigger wins, because I think that's why you see Wisconsin ranked ahead of them, is because they've both played 2 games. They're both 2-0, but Wisconsin's put up 40 points in each game and hasn't allowed more than 10, I believe. Michigan's 11, yeah. So it's a very impressive body of work so far for Wisconsin, and I think that's why you see them slotted in at 10 and 11. Another fun point to make about the rankings this week is you can't make this up. There's no ranked 16 team this week because Marshall and Coastal Carolina are both tied at number 15. They're both undefeated. They're both playing very good football, and they both slide in there at number 15. And they're probably the 2 of the biggest Cinderella teams that we've talked about on this podcast. What do we make of them being ranked together?
Well, I think it's kind of funny and it's apt. I mean, it's a weird year, and so you get 2 15th ranked teams in the country. That sounds like it's college basketball March Madness. You get a 15 seed playing a 2 seed, and you got 4 of them. Now you got 2 in college football, and they're both like mid majors in football. Like you got one from the Sun Belt and one from the Ohio Valley Conference at 15. They're both feel good stories. They're playing good football. And it's unsuspecting. It's a nice bright light on what's been a kind of a gloomy year. So you need some silver lining stories like that.
Yeah, they're not alone either. They're up at 15 though, but you see Liberty at 21. They moved up a slot after another win. Louisiana is up at 24 after another win, and then Tulsa just sneaked into the top 25. So these are 3 other teams that you don't necessarily would ever envision them being ranked in a normal sense of a year, but they're now all inside the top 25 and looking to continue building upon very good years so far for their programs. One last kind of point that I wanted to touch on in the rankings is we talked about how USC in our recap games was able to squeak out 2 wins in late fashion, being able to just make enough plays down the stretch to win. They stayed exactly where they're at number 20. They had Northwestern jump them, and yeah, that was the only team actually that jumped them this week. But what do we see from the committee and the AP that are saying, yeah, you need to be a little bit better to ensure us that you're able to move up in these rankings?
I thought it was appropriate. Both Oregon and USC didn't look great from the Pac-12, and neither moved. And I honestly would have been okay with either of them dropping, because you saw Miami slip to 12, even though they won against a better Virginia Tech team than Washington State is, in my opinion. And so if Oregon had fallen to 12, I wouldn't have batted an eye. And if USC had been jumped by Liberty, for instance, who's ranked at 21st, I would not have batted an eye. So I think it's a nice consistent message that says you need to be better because you only have these 6 games. And I kind of think that leads me into a question I'd been thinking about. Do you think any other Pac-12 team can make the top 25 this year, because they don't have as many chances at it, and they've missed some games already due to cancellations?
You look at some teams that would come to mind, and normal perennial powers such as Stanford, Washington, Utah, Arizona State, teams like that seem to be the next tier of their divisions. Stanford has started 0-2 after losing to Colorado, but that's a team, honestly, if Colorado continues to win and play well, I could see them getting into the top 25. You never know what's going to happen with Utah. I don't think they'll make the top 25, because I personally think whenever they start playing again, they're going to lose and lose badly. So I don't think Utah's necessarily in conversation. But then again, you look at Arizona State, and they're decimated due to COVID. So you look at things, and Washington State was tested by Oregon State in their game. And so it was just – and the Oregon State's a perennial bottom dweller in the Pac-12. So it's a very intriguing question, and I'm not sure necessarily that the answer is yes, because I think if you look outside of USC and Oregon, they're the 2 most talented teams in the Pac-12. But then also you have this Colorado team that's now 2-0, and they have everything in front of them if they continue to win. So I think that's probably the only other scenario that you could see a Pac-12 team win, unless Utah were to come out and start winning games very handily and go undefeated. But that's not going to happen. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens moving forward.
Yeah, what I think is, I think whoever comes out of the South with the best Pac-12 South, which is made up of Utah, Colorado, USC, UCLA, Arizona, and Arizona State. whoever comes out of the Pac-12 South will be ranked. And right now we've got USC, and UCLA is also undefeated. Oh no, they lost to Colorado. Excuse me. So they're 1-1, and Colorado's 2-0, and they're playing USC. So I think whoever wins that game, if Colorado were to knock off USC, USC would fall out of the poll, and Colorado would enter. But I don't think you're going to get more than 2, and at best 3 if Utah, like you said, Utah comes out and plays well, which I agree with you. I'm skeptical. And there's a possibility of Washington, but they didn't look very good against Oregon State. So I think it'll be a two-horse race in the Pac-12, and I don't think unless Oregon starts really picking it up, I don't think anyone's really got a chance at the playoff.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. So that's the rankings this week. Your top 11, once again, we'll just run through them, are Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Clemson, Texas A&M, Florida, Cincinnati, BYU, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Oregon. That is the kind of the threshold that we have laid out for you of teams that we think have a very foreseeable shot at the college football playoff. Anyone else is currently on the outside looking in our eyes. So that's going to do it for the rankings and this news episode for everyone. Once again, we did touch on a lot of the COVID protocols. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I would be happy to try and divulge some of this information a little bit more fluidly and better for all of you. We kind of jumped around through some of it. So let us know, please. It's a very trying time. It's a very difficult time to understand what all is happening, and we'll do all we can moving forward to get you that information. Do you have anything else to add before we sign off, Leif?
No, I think that's it, and I guess just keep your head on a swivel, looking out for some more podcasts from us. We're going to start up our basketball one this week, and we'll have some preview for Feast Week of basketball coming up, and then our usual football preview and recaps.
It's going to start picking up. We're getting double sported here soon. So we're gonna have some more episodes coming out for you and some things to watch out for. So for Leif and I, that's going to do it on this Tuesday episode of the College Sports Hive. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all on Thursday for a great preview.
See you.